So we are in our recording, so we'll go ahead and call the meeting to order at 9:02 a.m. Will you
Wait a
please start with
minute.
the roll call?
I can't
Okay.
see anybody still.
Can't see
you
anybody
think you need
online or
to-
can't see
No.
anyone at City Hall?
I can't see anyone online. Maybe it's me then. I'm gonna log off and
Yeah.
log back on.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Vice Chair Blair.
Okay.
Ms. May, do you want to start with the roll call?
Sure will. Okay. Chair Hampton,
Present.
Commissioner Popkin. Not here yet. We have Mr. McGregor. And I lost my feed. Not here yet. Okay. And then we have Mr. Hall.
Here.
Mr. Reeves.
I'm here.
Mr. Baring.
Here.
And Ms. Bagley.
Here.
All right, and I'll keep my eyes peeled for Commissioner McGregor and Ms. McGregor and Commissioner Popkin, and we'll wait for Vice Chair to return.
This is
we can
I do have to step aside for about 5 minutes. I should be right back though. I apologize for that unforeseen technical thing.
Understood. And Ms. May, while we're waiting for Vice Chair Blair to log back in, Mr. McGregor is in the meeting but needs to be moved as a panelist.
There's Commissioner Polk.
And I believe we see that Commissioner Popkin has just joined as well.
Great. Right.
Good morning.
And Vice Chair Blair. Awesome.
Vice Chair Blair, can you see us now?
Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Do you want me to say those last three names again?
If they could just acknowledge. So Mr. McGregor, I saw you wave your hand. Vice Chair Blair, can you see us and hear us? Lori, can you see us and hear us?
Is muted.
All right, looks like she's working through technical difficulties.
Okay. Can you hear me now? I can see
Yes.
everybody.
Yes, we can.
Ms.
Perfect.
Bagley, it's so nice to see you again.
So we are on the record. So Ms. Levy, if you want to start by reading the item into the record and give us your briefing and update from our last meeting. And before we do that, I will acknowledge that Commissioner Young is with me in the briefing room.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Microphone. I'm sorry, I was hearing some feedback. Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Welcome to our ZOAC meeting of January 31st. We have our item this morning of DCA 212007, consideration of amending Chapter 51A of the Dallas Development Code, Section 51A-4.701D, 2-year limitation to revise the applicability of the 2-year limitation and related regulations. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Can you see the screen? Getting a little bit of feedback.
Yeah, if everyone could mute their mics, please. We're hearing some equipment in the background.
Somebody's printer.
It's me, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Vice Chair Blair.
So again, this is the 2-year limitation. And we've had a few meetings on this, but so I'll go over again for anyone's benefit of joining for the first time. A little bit of background and history, the purpose of the code amendment, staff summary, issues, operational or business concerns, a staff update and analysis, staff recommendations, as well as ZOAC recommendations and our next steps. Back last year, May 11th, City Plan Commission approved this code amendment for, it's out of my way, I'm sorry. Approved the request of Chair Joanna Hampton, Vice Chair Brent Rubin, and Commissioner Michael Young for consideration of a code amendment of Chapter 51A-4.701D, 2-year limitation. And this was to consider revising the applicability, the standards for the waiver of the 2-year limitation and related regulations. The intent of the code amendment is to review the current 2-year waiting period for subsequent zoning changes, which includes specific use permit applications when the property has been granted approval previously. So purpose, again, the code amendment supports the goal to undergo regulatory review to remove barriers to growth and development for Dallas. The code amendment also directly correlates to our EDP or economic development policy to continue improving the development review processes for predictability for our applicants. And again, the larger goal would be to for the City of Dallas to meet the 10-year demand for business growth. Code amendment also will reduce the number of 2-year waiver applications that we present to CPC or City Plan Commission. Staff summary, staff's recommendations to remove granting approvals for the 2-year limitation supports the goal, again, to undergo the regulatory review to remove barriers to growth and development. And it does this several ways. It does it by significantly reducing the number of the waiver requests, that both staff and then ultimately CPC would have to review. It also significantly increases the number of exemptions for the 2-year waiting period from 49 to 94. That's out of a sample size that we did, looking back at the other applications that have come in for the waivers. It would significantly reduce staff time and CPC time. Again, it would align Dallas with other cities in both the DFW area and nationwide cities with respect to the waivers or the limitations. It would also allow staff to work with the applicants on more equitable and appropriate development requests. Some of the operational issues and concerns of the limitation, the existing 2-year limitation is a 2-year waiting period for subsequent applications that applies to, again, approvals. That's anything that was granted approval for all zoning changes, which includes the SUPs, unless the SUP has 2 years or less of a renewal imposed. It also impacts the denials with prejudice. And again, that just means that if a property had an approval for, a zoning change or an SUP, and then the applicant wants to submit another application for development on that same property within 2 years, under our rules right now, regulations for the 2-year waiting period right now, they would have to wait 2 years in order to submit any new application if they were denied with prejudice or even if they were approved, unless they went through the waiver process. So applying the current 2-year limitation is causing issues because, again, the only way for this applicant or property to get relief from the 2-year waiting period in that scenario is if they are granted a waiver from City Plan Commission. That's our only avenue. to be able to submit that application. The waiver from CPC also adds at least one additional month onto the development process via one additional public hearing to the standard 2 public hearings that's required. And again, for any zoning change or SUP, 2 public hearings are required, one being at City Plan Commission, the other being at City Council. That's the normal process. So if they fall under the 2-year limitation rule of within that 2-year period, they would then have to expend at least an additional month, and really it's longer than that. The process is still going to be probably more like 3 to 6 months or so. So it's adding that additional time. The commission must consider what is meant by changed circumstances regarding the property sufficient to warrant a new hearing. That's language already in the code. That's a little bit unclear for staff and the commission. Other issues, again, it's causing potentially development delays, which have occurred already and are still occurring. While eight waiver applications during the fiscal years of 2020 through 2022 that we looked at had been granted. So what we saw from a lot of that sample set, most of those waiver applications were to correct inconsistencies in the previous zoning or SUP ordinance, adjust for changes in market conditions or unrelated use to the new application requiring a waiver. For instance, like an SUP, maybe they had an SUP approved, maybe in a strip center, and now they want to apply for a totally different use, a totally different SUP on that same larger property, and that limitation kicks in. So a little bit of an update for our last meeting, which was January 17th. ZOAC requested staff to evaluate leaving the approvals granted in the 2-year waiver limitation or waiting period. Staff's recommendation, and staff did go through the process, but staff is recommending to exempt the approvals granted from the 2-year limitation because the approvals in that mix create more review time for both staff and CPC. They create more time for the applicant by extending the development process. Again, approximately 3 to 6 months is kind of what we're looking at. Does not allow us to significantly improve or streamline our development processes by reducing unnecessary reviews. Does not align our processes with most of our peer cities that we reviewed. Also may negatively impact or hinder further imminent or timely development of a property, and does not allow Dallas to be competitive with surrounding cities with respect to development opportunities due to development process delays. Also, per ZOAC's request, staff evaluated the additional suggested criteria for the commission to consider in granting the waivers, the waiver applications that would come in. And while staff agrees that the additional criteria is needed for clarification, we cannot support the entire list of criteria. Most of the cities that were reviewed, which was 15, do not provide the level of detail, and staff is concerned about the inconsistency with other cities, unintended consequences, and additional staff time for documentation and review, calling out a lot of those factors. Staff does support adding the following out of those suggestions for consideration of waivers. One would be the suggestion by ZOAC to change circumstances regarding the property sufficient to warrant a new hearing, changing that as or something similar to specific and material changes for which the original decision was made. And I don't know that we use that exact verbiage, but we try to put that intent in there. The previous final decision was for an SUP. The previous final decision was city initiated. The land area of the previous final decision is expected to significantly change in the subsequent request. And then other specific and material changes are expected in the subsequent request. Kind of giving that a little bit more flexibility for, something unforeseen. Staff cannot support adding the following for consideration of the waivers. And we'll kind of elaborate on the reasons a little. Unanimity of the previous decision. We did look at that when, kind of looked at some different variations of language and, but, ultimately what we came back to was the majority vote already required, that's already required by CPC or the Commission and Council for final decisions is already built in. You already have to have a majority vote in order for something to either pass or fail. So that unanimity is already assumed. So that's one thing. And then we looked at the degree to which community was in support. And again, we kind of went back and forth with that. And, we realized that there's so many extraneous factors that go into community support. When we register opposition, for instance, and or support. But a lot of times when we first put a case first gets noticed, because we have to do that earlier and we get the case report out, a lot of times there may not be a good understanding until we actually have that meeting and are able to, provide more details and present the item that, on its surface, someone or the community may just register opposition because really they're not sure, what the details are. It just sounds like maybe something that, they may not want to support. It also, or they'll turn it in just to buy some time so that they can learn those details or, work with the applicant on the request to get it to something that they would want to support, basically. And then, other unknown factors, but, so there are just so many factors that go into, support. Also, it may not, the support or lack thereof may not be very, it may not be completely representative of the overall community because a lot of times you don't get, correspondence or any responses from businesses or condominium owners, renters, a lot, it's single family. We know that we get a lot of, that type of, opposition or support, but we don't always hear from the entire community, on an issue. May not be representative of the group that even originally submitted the opposition. And I kind of, mentioned that, a minute ago, where those who were in opposition previously, and then they learn more about the details in the meeting, or they contact staff, or commission, or, council, whoever, and they find out more details and more information. They may say, oh, okay, well, I'm in support now, but a lot of times they do not resubmit their written testimony. So we just don't feel like that's, there's so many factors. Staff cannot support also adding the time period that elapsed since the previous request. We don't really have an objective parameter in which to measure that. Is it close to the time? Is it, where is it in the spectrum? We're not, we don't feel like that's something we can support. But we are open to a reduction of the waiting period or the time of that limitation. Of course, right now it's 2 years. But of the 15 cities that we looked at, most of them don't have a 2-year waiting period. 9 of the 12 cities that have a limitation at all, because 3 cities did not have a limitation at all, but 9 of the 12 that did have it for 1 year. And I listed those cities out. Austin's a little bit different than pretty much all of them, and they have a limitation for 1.5 years. Proposed amendments, and I've put on the same slide where, ZOAC's request, or where they maybe differ a little bit than staff's recommendation, just so you can see it stacked up. So ZOAC's request, as we understood it, was accept as provided in subsections D2 and D3 after a final decision is reached by the commission or city council, either granting or denying a request for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary. No subsequent applications may be considered for that property for 2 years from the date of the final decision. And then the second part, really maintaining that for the most part as it is, just really putting the hyphen between 2 year. But if the commission or city council renders a final decision of denial without prejudice, or if the city council grants a specific use permit and imposes a time limit of 2 years or less, the 2-year limitation is waived. So again, that's what that is really the difference. That's leaving in the approvals, anything that was granted approval within that 2 years. Staff's recommendation is accept as provided in subsections D2 and D3 after a final decision is reached by the commission or city council, denying a request for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary. No subsequent applications may be considered for that property for 2 years from the date of the final decision. Again, the distinction there is removing the approvals. And then same thing with the second sentence. There's no need to have the language about the SUP because we're taking out approvals, period. So if the commission or the city council renders a final decision of denial without prejudice, the 2-year limitation is waived. So that's really the only condition we were leaving in there, was the denial without prejudice. And then this one, no change between, what we heard from ZOAC and, and what staff was proposing to leave in there. A property owner may apply for a waiver of the 2-year limitation in the following manner. And then just changing the pronouns, for how that should occur. So the applicant shall submit the request in writing to the director. The director shall inform the applicant of the date on which the commission shall consider the request and shall advise the applicant of the right to appear before the commission. Again, this would be where the factors or the, criteria that, which, a waiver would be granted by the commission. So ZOAC's request, what we thought we heard, the commission may consider the following factors when determining whether to waive the 2-year limitation and grant a new hearing if there are changed circumstances, excuse me. There are changed circumstances regarding the property. The length of time has elapsed since the previous zoning decision. If the previous final decision for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary of the property was city initiated. If the previous request was for a specific use permit. If significant and material changes between the previous and subsequent requests are expected, including but not limited to a change in land area, the nature of the subsequent request, or new circumstances or information has been discovered that were unforeseeable. If the previous final decision for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary of the property was not unanimous, and the degree to which public responses to the previous final decision were received, and other factors in which granting a waiver is not contrary to the public interest. A little bit different, staff recommendation. The commission may waive the 2-year limitation if there are changed circumstances sufficient to warrant a new hearing, including but not limited to the previous final decision was for a specific use permit. The previous final decision was city initiated. The land area of the previous final decision is expected to significantly change in the subsequent request, or other specific immaterial changes are expected in the subsequent request. C and D, the last 2 paragraphs are pretty much the same. We just reordered it a little bit, and then had to re-sequence the lettering. But a simple majority vote by the commission is required to grant the request. If a waiver is granted, the applicant shall follow the procedure for a zoning amendment per this article or a request for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary. If the commission denies the request, the applicant may appeal in writing to the city council by filing an appeal with the director. So staff is recommending approval of staff's proposed amendments and move the item to city Plan Commission. Of course, if if ZOAC recommends approval today or modification thereof, we anticipate forwarding that to the next available City Plan Commission. We may still be able to get it on in February. I'm not sure. We can try. If not, the next available, and then of course, then on to City Council at the next available meeting, which is possibly March. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. Members, questions? And you're all arrayed on the top of the screen, so you may need to speak up. Well, I'm happy to kick us off. Ms. Levy, I think you covered this in your briefing. The 4 items that are recommended by staff under, I'm going to call them the factors. So item D, B. Is it correct that those are generally within the larger list that ZOAC has proposed or is considering, I shouldn't say proposed, considering per last meeting's discussion?
We've only changed it a little. Yes, a lot of that is in there, ZOACs, but there were a few that we just couldn't.
No, understood. I understand it's not a 1-for-1, but for instance, both of them have the previous final decision was a specific use permit.
Correct.
Both have the previous final decision was city initiated. I think it's Romanet 2 and staff's recommendation. It is Romanet 3 with slightly different wording in the ZOAC request. Staff has the land area for your Romanet 3, which is included in 5 AA on ZOAC, and then D, other specific and material changes are expected is Romanet 4 and staff, and that is also Romanet 4 in ZOAC request with a little bit of wording change.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes,
so
correct.
one global question. There's both specific and significant are used and sort of swapped out between the 2 requests. Is there a meaning difference there that staff evaluated? Is there a reason why we would use those different words?
I'm sorry, can you say the different words again? What?
Significant and specific.
Significant and specific. Okay. So, yes, I think, you're referring probably to Romanet 3 with significantly. We did add significantly because again, we're trying to avoid those applications that come in where they modified just enough to, to get under the radar, so to speak, or, modifying it just a hair, just to, say that it's changed from the initial request. So we kind of put significantly because, we want to convey that, just one little minor, tweak is not going to, it's not going to be sufficient.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to understand. So then related to that, so I wanted to make sure I kind of had a one-for-one on that. The other, I guess, variants I'm trying to get through, I've got a lot of notes here. And so trying to get all this back together. Back to the question of ZOAC's Romanet 5. The previous final decision for the change in zoning classification or boundary was not unanimous in the degree. I understand that in our last meeting, what I heard was a way to consider if there was significant opposition, if there was significant either support, either one of those as the request went through the process. I don't know that it was tied necessarily to responses. I think staff, as rightly pointed out, I think we're all aware that sometimes responses don't always capture, they don't get updated. I think we've all seen that. But was there any consideration of capturing that concept differently? In other words, tying it to simply maybe something as simple of the degree of unanimity or opposition in the prior request, simply as a consideration versus responses.
We did. Again, if you don't do it by the public responses, then how do you measure that? How do you have something specific in which to measure it? And again, as far as the unanimity, it has to be unanimous to either pass or fail. So you do have that, but how do you measure that degree? How do you?
Well, I think maybe I can think of a few cases where we had split votes. It was 9-4. It was 14-1. I think the decision, the final decision that was rendered itself, might give you an indication of that.
Yeah. Another thing or another factor was, again, staff time. I mean, staff would have to go back and, collect all this documentation and look for all of this documentation. That was another factor, that we did look at. Again, we're not trying to extend, and elongate or extend the process beyond what it already is, because we feel like what it already is lengthy enough and, quite frankly, onerous and maybe not efficient or necessary even for approvals, at least.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. And like I said, I was just trying to get some more context on that. And then final question on this question of time period. I know we did ask staff to help us understand if that was something that we should consider in more detail. 2-year is our current limitation. We at least have a few other, cities that match us on that 2-year. But I think part of the discussion that I heard was trying to understand if there should be a minimum instead of a blanket change of our 2-year waiver when we say that if we were to consider the length of time that has elapsed since the previous final decision as a factor, I mean, should that be something that said, not less than 1 year, so that, we didn't get inundated requests? Because again, I think many times what I have observed is that it's a denial without prejudice many times is anticipating there's going to be that new request coming in. Whereas if there's an approval or a denial, but again, it gives at least some time to change. Was that anything? Because that 1 year seems to be, I think you said it was 9 of the 14 cities you all had evaluated used 1 year just as the blanket time period.
Yeah, again, we would be open to the length of time, certainly, of the waiver, of the limitation, not being 2 year, being, another year, absolutely. Is it what we had an issue or just what we were struggling with and just couldn't see, putting in the length of time that has elapsed since the previous decision because, where do you put that?
Okay.
I mean,
All right.
much
And then
time is enough time,
Okay. And so final question for me, could you put up your slide number 4? Oh, you are, no, slide 14. I just saw that we're on 16, where you did the items 1 and 2 stacked. So between ZOAC and staff recommendation on item 2, originally it was struck that said a specific use permit for a time limit of less than 2 years. So staff has still struck that. It's not in ZOAC's right now, but is that not still needed as an exception because effectively you can't file? You couldn't file for your renewal if that's removed. Isn't that correct?
Okay. I'm not sure I'm understanding, so I'm going to try. In staffs, we don't need it because again, we're taking out all of the approvals. So,
got it. Thank you. I knew I was missing a nuance in there.
Okay.
All right. So did that open up any questions from any of our other members?
Yes, Madam Chair, this is Mark Reeves.
Yes, Mr. Reeves. Sorry, I can't see you. Thank you for speaking up.
Oh, okay. Thank you. My camera is on. So I think one might be an observation first to start off with. I know that staff has talked here about saving time, but I didn't take the initial charge from CPC with necessarily looking at saving time. Now, saving time is not a bad thing, don't get me wrong, but I think the initial experience of that, especially with what I had experienced on the council was, or on the commission, was just the way that you could look at one of these waivers, expanding that breadth of the way you could look at these. That's the way I read the initial charge, not like we need to speed up time on this. So I think that's an observation, and if anybody else wants to chime in on that, that would be fine. The second thing I want to go back to, and I'm kind of bouncing around here. Sorry about that. Let's see. I wasn't able to print my printers out of toner cartridge, and I have an old printer and I can't get it this century apparently. So normally I print things out old school and mark them up. So I'm kind of lost. So on page 1-6 of the staff report, we're talking about the unanimity of the vote on the previous decision to the degree. And staff does point out since community input has historically been one of many factors. Then it says in the next paragraph, in most cases, responses collected are primary from selected long-term residential property owners who would rather have their dissenting views known and mend fences later in the event that the applicant's request passes. And then finally it says down at the next paragraph, property owners who had originally sent responses in opposition rarely update their original position in time to update the register of responses. So I think those are very good statements if we allow approvals to come back without the waiver. But if we were to say, no, if you do have an approval and you still have to come back from the waiver, well, that would still be circulated. And I guess this is a question for staff. So let's say you do have to come back for a waiver if your zoning was approved. That comes before CPC. That is noticed, correct? And people get to put in responses at that point, whether they're thumbs up for the waiver or thumbs down for the waiver, or is that not a notice prospect.
The waiver is not a notice process, no.
Okay, so that's not as, okay, so that, all right. So thank you for clarifying that. So, and my next observation would be the difference between the ZOAC request and the staff recommendation. The thing that sits out to me with the ZOAC request, it says the commission may consider the following factors. It doesn't say thou shalt consider them. It doesn't say they will consider them. It says they may consider them. And going about, maybe selfishly speaking, going back when I was on CPC, I still see things that people will argue about in staff's recommendation is not really what's the spirit and intent. And I think ZOAC actually has a really good spirit and intent. And if I look at that, and I know that we said, well, the final decision, the Romanet number 5, the previous final decision for a change in the zoning district classification or boundary was not unanimous in the degree to which the public responses previously final decision were received. I can tell you right now, Henderson, it was nasty. Lincoln Katy Trail, nasty. I don't need staff to go back and research how many votes one way or the other. I can remember them. They kept me up at night. So if I'm that plan commissioner, that's not going to take staff's time with this. So, and again, maybe we take out the unanimous or something like that. But to me, I think that's a valuable statement that if I was pitching my case to my fellow commission members, I would like to use that statement. I could say, look, remember, Lincoln Katy Trail was really contentious. A lot of people spent a lot of time on this. And I will say the applicant usually has money in the game. Matter of fact, they always have money in the game. Their zoning consultants have money in the game. The neighborhood doesn't have money in the game. And there is something very much called zoning fatigue. And I think that is a very valuable something that needs to stay in there. And I would also say, going back to zoning fatigue, if an applicant is approved, I still think they should come back for this waiver. It's 1 month. And again, I don't think the charge was shortening staff. It's 1 month. Bring that back, because it could be, the old adage of the frog. You throw the frog in boiling water, it hops out. But if I just keep, coming back, and the neighborhood is worn out from it, then the applicant it's a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan. The zoning fatigue can definitely take place. So I think what the ZOAC request has done gives more discussion points of something you can do. The commissioner still has to make a pitch to their fellow commissioners to get it done or not. I don't see that taking up a lot of staff's time. And I don't see, if it's 1 month to come back from an approval, I don't see that taking up a lot of staff's time either. It's 1 month. And I don't think that was the original charge of this. So that was some questions and more statements. I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves.
Chair Hampton, this is Sarah May.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
Miss May, thank you. You're all just 5 boxes on the top of the screen.
Yeah,
6 actually.
I
Thank
figured you couldn't see us all. So I really like what Mr. Reeves said, and that it's staff's intent that the commission and even staff would have at least a short-term memory to remember what happened 2 years ago or less. Especially those contentious cases. I think that it's still a part of staff's recommendation. It's just not explicitly stated to be something that staff must produce information on.
I don't think staff has to produce information on that. I mean, I could tell you, like I said, Lincoln Katy Trail, you know how contentious that was. I don't need you to tell me how contentious that was.
Right. But staff does try to assist the commission by providing as much information as the code, outlines, and more, sometimes. So I think that's our struggle with listing it as a criteria, is that we must, or that we will feel obligated to provide novels of emails from Yolanda and you know, it might be overwhelming. Is basically the summary of our objection of.
And I don't want to
writing
speak
that.
for the current commissioners on there, but I think they would say they don't need that from staff. I'm pretty sure they would say that. And again, it says the commission may consider. It's not you shall consider, it's they may consider. And a commissioner might not consider that at all, but another commissioner on that council may say, well, wait a minute, there was a lot of, you know, weeping and gnashing of teeth over there. Let's discuss this. And I just don't see, you know, coming back to staff on that personally. Now, could that happen? Yes. So I agree and disagree respectfully there, Ms. May.
So, Ms. May, if I may just follow up on that, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this correctly. I think it's the responses part that I'm not sure is really capturing either, you know, what I heard in the last discussion. It could literally be, I would think it's something as simple as this was the prior vote by CPC and by council, which you would already have in terms of what staff would need to either prepare or consider potentially in their evaluation of the request, because it is two-pronged for this. If a waiver is submitted, it is reviewed by staff, staff makes a recommendation, it then goes to City Plan Commission. They then review staff report and also do their own due diligence generally for that commissioner. As Mr. Reeves mentioned, I think many of us are either familiar with the cases in our district, but if it was perhaps how this is worded is also potentially creating more work than was necessarily intended in the spirit of what the language was wanting or suggesting might be a consideration. That may, I actually did go back and check the may. That is a standard that we use in other parts of our code that just help provide guidance. So is that, if it removed responses, I understand staff generally has concerns about including this as a potential standard or factor for consideration, but if it removed responses, would that do anything to address either Ms. May or Ms. Levy on how you all would evaluate the item?
Yeah, I think it certainly would be easier to just produce the minutes of whatever that final decision was. And that would be little to no additional efforts by staff. We're open to, you know, other alternatives and variations for sure.
Thank you, Ms. May. So I'm trying to scroll across. I'm going to start trying to go down each one of these Romanettes if there's no other either questions or specific items from other members. And I think Commissioner Young may have some thoughts for us.
Madam Chair, are you willing to entertain public commentary?
Yes, we did. Thank you. And before Commissioner Young starts, I did want to acknowledge Ms. May, we do not have any registered speakers on this item. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Commissioner Young.
And
Thank you. Yes, right.
Ms. May. We've lost
Sorry,
your
I had to
visual
find my
on
button.
screen.
If I may, hey Lori, can you go back to staff's recommendation box? I did want to point out that we were kind of torn when we were writing this particular box. Let me explain, I guess, is where I'm going with that. So if the previous final decision was for a specific use permit and the approvals are exempted from a 2-year waiver requirement, I think that could be, you know, whether or not it was for an SUP, could be something that could be considered in the specific or significant and material changes are expected. So, you know, if approvals are exempt, then we might not need number 1 if we have, you know, that last item. Also, city initiated zoning changes are typically the options are approved with like modifications or no change. It's rarely ever like denied. So so again, if we exempt approvals, we may not need number 2. And I also think that if the land area changes, that could be another specific and material change, and we may not need that either. So staff's recommendation could be a lot smaller if we know that approvals are exempt. Now, if approvals are not exempt, we would like to put these items in there. So that's kind of why we chose to have more words rather than less. But I just kind of wanted to point that out.
Thank you, Ms. May. Commissioner Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, ZOAC members, for having the opportunity to speak to you today. I'm going to speak generally in favor of what is listed in the docket as the ZOAC request, with a couple of suggested additions to that document. And I want to use as an example as I go along my first major zoning case as a planning commissioner 35 years ago, which was the Dallas Arboretum. On the Dallas Arboretum case, there were many, many people in the community in support. There were many, many people in the community in opposition. The sources of the opposition were very widespread. Some were opposed to any development of an arboretum on that site. A lot of people were concerned about the proposal to have the main entrance to the Arboretum off of East Lawther Drive. Other concerns included a destination restaurant, an observation tower, and various other issues. I remember all of that as clearly as if it were yesterday, down to who was in each of those camps. As for the question of exempting approvals, the Arboretum case was approved, but it was approved without an East Lawther Drive entrance, without an observation tower, and without a destination restaurant, much to the chagrin and consternation of the Arboretum and many of its supporters. To exempt approvals from the waiver process means that that applicant and those supporters could have immediately turned around and refiled the day after council approval to get all of those additional bells and whistles that they had been denied. That approval, in fact, had an embedded denial within it of many of the things that the applicant in that case wanted. And I think we can think of other examples. I mentioned some to you at your last meeting. So I think it's very important to include approvals in this process. Next, with respect to the criteria for granting or denying the waiver, I think the ZOAC request encapsulates a broader set of criteria, and I think therefore a more appropriate set of criteria. Yes, as the staff points out, many of them are subjective, but again, I've not done any analysis, but I would guess that at any particular time, the average tenure of members of the Plan Commission is somewhere upwards of 2 years. And so when a case comes before the commission on a waiver application, there are going to be at least several commissioners who are well familiar with the case that was previously heard and can evaluate these criteria against it, including the proposed criterion, which I don't see in the staff report as part of the ZOAC request, the degree of community support or opposition. I don't think that that is in any way limited to ballots. I think each commissioner could do what I've just done and say, well, Commissioner Reeves, I remember the Lincoln Katy Trail case very well, or Commissioner Blair, I remember this case or that case, and each commissioner will have their own set of perhaps favorable, perhaps unfavorable memories of particularly contentious cases, but in any event, we'll be well aware and able to provide that information with only a minimum of staff input. I think the suggestion that staff could provide the minutes or other basic objective information is a good one. And I think that can then be supplemented with information that the commission already has. I do want to suggest an amendment to the criteria in the ZOAC request. The last one, D3, D6, right now it says something like any reason, let me get it in front of me. Other factors in which granting a waiver is not contrary to the public interest. That puts the thumb on the scale. There also should be considered other factors in which granting a waiver is contrary to the public interest. And so I would suggest changing is not to is or is not, so that if there is a reason why that's not on the list, why granting a waiver is contrary to the public interest, that can be considered. Finally, I want to address the issue of timing, whether the period should be 2 years or a lesser period. I think that should be evaluated on a sliding scale. And in the ZOAC criteria, the length of time is listed. If the application comes in 1 month after the prior approval or denial, that says one thing. If it comes in 23 months after the prior approval or denial, that says something rather different. So I think that's already encapsulated. I don't think the waiver process itself is particularly onerous. If the committee is concerned about the not discouraging development applications, not adding to the delay process, my suggestion for you would be to consider whether to allow a new application to be filed contingent at the same time as a waiver application is filed, so that it gets into the pipeline, but that application will be contingent on approval of a waiver, perhaps with a refund of the filing fee if the waiver is denied. I'm not sure that's necessary, but if the committee believes it is, that would be a way to give the waiver applicant a head start so that the waiver process does not delay his application. We may someday get to a level of funding for the staff where an application is considered in depth soon after it is filed. Right now, we are not at that stage, and applications do not receive significant processing immediately upon filing, other than perhaps the early warning notices. So I thank you for your time and look forward to your decision.
Thank you, Commissioner Young. Members, additional discussion? Mr. Hall.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment or two about the public input. I don't have any CPC experience on this, but I'm into my 4th year on ZOAC, and just trying to gauge what public opinion really is about an issue, I find is a very difficult thing. And looking back at the input we just had on short-term rentals, we had hundreds and hundreds of comments made, but trying to determine really what was the degree of public support or disapproval was very difficult for me. So I'm not sure if there's a scientific way of evaluating what the public really thinks about any particular issue. There's so many variables, so many people were repeatedly speaking, saying the same things. I just wonder, I have no recommendations, but just think it would be very difficult to include public input without really knowing how to understand what the public really thinks, other than just what a handful of more determined people think. So I'll just throw that out there. I just find it a very difficult issue to get my head around when you're trying to determine opposition or support for a particular initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. So members, I'm down to seeing 4 boxes on the screen. So if there's other comments, I'm going to ask you to speak up. All right, I'm going to try to take a pass at going through this, and if we can either have comments or see if there's what our next steps are on this. So I'm just going to start back at the top, and Ms. Levy, if you would kindly go down. Thank you. You've got slide 14 up. So on our first item, I guess I'll ask the general question. We have a 2-year limitation on our waiver. We had asked staff to look at if that should be a different period. Staff's given us the information. I don't think we've had any discussion that says it should be less than 2 years. Does anyone want to review that further, or do we all feel like 2 years is the appropriate period? Hearing none, I'm going to say we're going to hold it 2 years. Okay. So our next, we have 2 boxes on ZOAC request and staff recommendation. And so we've got a couple of changes here, one of which is whether or not we would remove approvals from the waiver. That's in section 1, where we would strike granting or denying or keep granting. So our last discussion was to keep approvals within the waiver request. So any discussion on ZOAC request D1? All right, I'm hearing none. So I'm going to say that.
I would say we keep approvals. Approvals need the requirement of the waiver as well.
Yeah, I certainly think that's appropriate based on our discussion. Yes, thank you, Commissioner Popkin. Okay, so ZOAC request 1, and then I think the other, the further to subsequent, which is some wordsmithing by staff and city attorney. So item 2, we have maintained the specific use permit with a period of less than 2 years. Once we keep approvals, we need to keep that language so that those can be filed timely. And then the 2-year with the hyphen is just a cleanup on language. Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is ZOAC request D1 and 2 is where we're still recommending that language. Okay. So on items 3A, again, these were just changing of some grammar and some language. Any discussion on these? Okay, that brings us to 3B. So we have the ZOAC request box, and then we have staff recommendation box. So I'm going to go through these one by one. So on B, the commission may consider the following factors when determining whether to waive the 2-year limitation and grant a new hearing. And it has the word if. I'm going to suggest that we don't need the word if y'all will just keep that in mind as we read through that. So the first item, Romanet 1, there is a changed circumstance regarding the property. And so that would strike sufficient to warrant a new hearing. That's our current standard. So that would, to recall Commissioner Young's comment from the last one, if you had a property that was under a lake and is no longer under a lake, that would be a changed circumstance on the property. So we would keep that open. Any discussion on Romanet 1? Okay, hearing none. So Romanet 2, the length of time that has elapsed since the previous zoning decision. So my only, I would like to open for discussion is whether or not that should include shall not be less than 1 year. We had discussion at our last hearing about potentially setting a minimum time period.
I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm fine the way it is, the way it is on the screen right now.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Young.
Madam Chair, we discussed this briefly at the last meeting. I think all the commissioners are familiar with instances where someone comes in for a complex PD and one provision of it turns out to be not exactly what was needed. It might be signage, it might be a setback, it's something like that. And I think we're going to ask for trouble if we say that high school or that mixed use development or whatever it is has to wait a year before it can come back in.
Thank you, Commissioner Young. All right, so there's no further discussion. We will proceed with Romanet 2 per the case report. Okay. Hearing none. All right, Romanet 3. If the previous final decision for a change in a zoning district classification or boundary of the property was city initiated. Any discussion, any comments?
I simply have a wordsmithing comment here, Madam Chair. Instead of if,
Yes.
well, for this one and the next two ones, perhaps whether is more accurate. Or
Well, and that's where I think I come back to the multiple ifs that we have as, so would that perhaps just be struck on each of those so that it starts with the previous final decision?
I think I'm suggesting replacing if with whether.
With whether, all right. All right,
Chair-
so on,
Chair Hampton, this is Sarah again.
yes, Miss May.
I do see all the ifs, and that makes sense now. Your previous thing, like, do we need to strike if? So thank you for finally having that register. I will say we might want to ask the attorneys if they have a particular way that they like the code to say, or we could just leave it up to them if you like, because of course they will be making sure all of this is correct. I was always taught that we don't use if, we say when. Like, this requirement is required when, but you know, if is there already, so who knows? That's all I had to say about the if.
So can I ask a
Thank you.
question, please?
Commissioner Blair, Vice Chair Blair.
So are we saying when you go back up to B that says the commission may consider the following factors when determining whether to waive the 2-year limitation and grant a new hearing, and strike that if and put whether at that spot, or just completely? I'm looking at you, yeah, Enrique.
Yes.
So
Yes,
you're saying just strike that if completely, and then say Romanet number 1 there, and then 2 the list.
Vice Chair
Right.
Blair. I believe we have the city attorney with us who's going to help us with some of our language.
Okay, great. Because I'm trying to stay on task and trying to stay focused and follow you, but I'm not.
Yep,
There's too many ifs, and so because then you have if and does one if cancel out the other if?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think the easiest thing to do is just strike the if in paragraph B, and then in front of Romanet 3, turn that if into whether. And then the same with Romanets 4 and 5, strike those ifs and turn them into whether.
Thank you. Commissioner Blair, Vice Chair Blair, and members, did we all track that?
Yes, and
so we're going to strike if at the end of B, and then in Romanet 3, 4, and 5, change if to whether.
Yes, I did, and I've updated my page to reflect that. So then 5 years from now, when I come back and I look at this, I'll remember what we said. I'm not like Commissioner Young, who can remember 5 years ago.
Or more.
Or more.
So thank you. Okay, so on Romanet 3, we're going to change if to whether with no other change. Okay, Romanet 4. Again, we're going to change if to whether the previous request was for a specific use permit. And I'm going to ask for a city attorney clarification. On ZOAC request, we have request written. On staff recommendation, which would be Romanet 1, they use final decision. Did that read final decision or request?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that it should be recommendation for staff, not final decision. Correct.
So you're saying that you can have instances where request is for a specific use permit, but the final decision does not involve an SUP? I'm trying to follow the logic.
The logic is that the final decision rests with council and that CPC would make its recommendation to council.
But this would be what the case was, the prior case.
Oh, I see. I got you. Well, and I guess that's not, I see the previous part, but I think we're talking about the difference between the word request and final decision. Would they be different in any case? I mean,
Well, yeah, because the request could be one thing and the final decision something entirely different. Because by the time it gets to CPC and is hashed out at CPC, there could be some changes on the floor that the request goes to city council, and city council approves that request based on the changes that were made at the recommendation of changes made at CPC. So then it could come back and say, okay, we had there was nothing that was unanimous about it because it was altered at different periods. Even at city council, you see changes made.
And
okay,
so I think this is maybe a little more global. And Mr. McGregor, I think your question is, can a request vary if it's submitted as a straight zoning change or it's submitted as an SUP and somehow is changed to remove that, and that's a noticing that happens. But I think the city attorney is going to tell us if that language should be request or final decision.
Okay, we'll go with that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On closer examination, I think that it should be final decision, not request.
It's two different things completely.
Right.
Right, because it's the action that was taken is what we are evaluating for the waiver.
Right.
So request would be changed to final decision. So Romanet 4 would read, whether the previous final decision was for a specific use permit.
So you said if the previous final decision.
Whether the previous final decision was for a specific use permit. So change if to whether and change request to final decision.
Okay, got it.
All right, any additional discussion? All right, so I've now caught that we have a numerical numbering. So we have a duplicate Romanet 4. So our next item will be revised to Romanet 5. And then this is where we have AA, BB, and CC. So we change if to whether significant and material changes between the previous and subsequent requests are expected, including but not limited to, and then you all can see this up, it continues, AA, a change in land area, BB, the nature of the subsequent request, or CC, new circumstances or information has been discovered that were unforeseeable. Any discussion? All right, hearing none.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
quick question on BV. What exactly do we mean by the nature of a subsequent request?
The original request was for a multifamily project, and the new request is for a townhouse.
Okay.
I mean, that would be one example, is that it was a change in use. I think a video board was one of the other examples we used. We had a garage that came in with an SUP for a video board, and then we had to get a waiver for a restaurant that was going in the ground floor.
Okay. Could it, just so that we don't end up with unforeseen misuses of the word nature, could we be more specific than just saying nature? And I don't know exactly what that would be, but the Bay zoning, or I would look to staff whether there's a word that would be more accurate than just nature. Because I'm trying to think of an example where you can change the nature of a subsequent request, but it's not we're intending it to be. For example, I'd have to think about it.
Would it be type? Well, no type is any clearer.
Zoning type, code type. We can let it go and maybe come back to it later if anybody has an idea. And perhaps nature is fine.
Okay, I will circle that one so that we confirm that before we make any final determinations.
Thank you.
All right, so the next, prior Romanet 5, now Romanet 6. If the previous final decision for a change in zoning district classification or boundary of the property was not unanimous in the degree to which public responses to the previous final decision were received. So this was our earlier discussion. I would suggest that we strike the end of the sentence from the and that we add essentially whether it was the unanimous or essentially opposition or support, that we capture the concept of, as we've talked about, and I know many of us are familiar, you can have a unanimous decision that may have been 2 years in the making and had some critical components that were part of that approval.
I'll just briefly start with wordsmithing again. Once again, change if for whether.
If to whether.
Yes, thank you.
And Madam Chair, if you do that, then you need to say was or was not unanimous.
Was or was not unanimous?
Yes.
You should have coffee.
So whether the previous final decision for a change in zoning district classification or boundary of the property was or was not unanimous.
I have a question here. Help me with language. Unanimous to me means that there was 100% vote in favor or against, right? But if we have a 14-1 or 9-4 in the examples that Madam Chair provided earlier, that's not, in my mind, that's not unanimous, but someone probably is better at the English language than I am.
I have a suggestion. I didn't like the word unanimous in there. And how about we flip this up and we say, actually, we keep the last part and the degree in which public responses to the previous final decision were received. But we start it with the degree and or level of opposition to which public responses to the previous final decision were received.
Say that again, please.
The degree and or level of opposition to which public responses to the previous final decision were received or was received.
Level of.
They and or yeah, the degree and or level of opposition to which public responses to the previous final decision were received. Because technically, I mean, like, I'll go back to Commissioner Young's example of the Arboretum, and I remember that vaguely, but I was not a participant. Is that could have been unanimous, that the CPC could have unanimously supported that with those compromises, but then the applicant could have come right back and said, no, I want my tower and I want my entrance exit on Lawther, and even though that it was very contentious. So that, and it could have been unanimous, but it was really contentious. So that unanimous bothers me.
So, Mr. Reeves, that goes back to what I was saying in regards to it. There's changes that could be made at CPC, and that recommendation that was brought forth at City Council could also be changed. And we have something that's different than what was originally brought in. And what you're adding to that is that the applicant could come back after after City Council had the final vote and said, no, I don't like any of that, and I want to start all over again.
Or I want my observation tower, and that was, a hard, one thing that everybody, the council, the commission and city council agreed, no, you're not going to get your observation tower, but they come right back for that. And it could have been unanimous support for the agreement. So it's kind of like it's punishing you for trying to get a unanimous support on something at that compromise, and people did compromise. And now you have to say, because we compromised, it actually hurts it. Potentially.
Or because we compromised it through our process, it became a different product than what the applicant really wanted, and now they're starting all over again. So the question begs, so from what you and I are saying, the question begs, how do you put that in writing and insert it there?
Yeah, and that's why I said the degree and or level of opposition to which public responses to the previous final decision were received.
So then that would go back, and I would go back and ask legal, can you help us with that? That would give us a legal word or legal definition, or how to legally put that in writing, so that we capture the essence of what Mr. Reeves and I are asking for, so that we still don't get staff and CPC to overwork and see a case that comes through as many times as the applicant is willing to pay for the process.
And again, it is the commission may consider it. It's not shall consider. It's squishy. All of this is kind of squishy, which I think is the intention.
It goes back to our May standard. So
yes.
I'm doing the same thing. So Mr. Reeves, you started with the degree to which public responses to the previous final decision were received.
Yes, that's the way I started, and then I added and or the level of the degree and or level of opposition.
And if I may, it looks like we would be able to break this down into two components. One of them is looking at the vote count on the final decision at council. That gives you an idea of how much, what was going on there. In addition to that, the responses from the public.
Well, and I think I was on that track with you, Mr. McGregor. I had started with the degree of support or opposition of the prior final decision.
And I would change the word, their decision to vote, I think, to be even more specific about that.
Well, I think what we need to confirm is who's making that final decision, because the final decision could be at City Plan Commission if it's denial and they don't appeal to council, or it could be council. And so who's the body who's making that final decision? So would another potential solution here be the nature and degree of public support for or opposition to the prior final decision? Does that
like
capture?
I like that. Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Hall.
Yeah, again, I'm just really sort of stuck on that, but you know, whenever we talk about the degree, it becomes a complex issue. And I'm just looking at some notes here. Back in October, on short-term rental, we had 36 public speakers at one of our meetings. And I made the note that pro short-term rental 15, anti 21. Now, there's not a big difference between 15 and 21, but I also made that the anti-speakers, many of those people had already spoken at previous meetings for up to 4 times. And so if you just tally pros and cons, you're going to get numbers, but some of those numbers are the same people saying the same thing over and over and over at different meetings. And we saw the same things with letters that we got and emails and so forth. So I think we have to be a little bit careful when we say, I mean, how do you evaluate the degree? And it may be overwhelmingly anti or overwhelmingly for, but I think it takes a bit of evaluation as to what's the true degree. I have no wisdom to offer about how to word anything like that. It's just that as a scientist, I think that I need precise data to understand an issue.
So can I, Chair?
Vice Chair Blair.
So Mr. Hall, I'm hearing you say that the level, the degree of which anyone agrees or disagrees is subjected to the input of data that we receive. And if you're looking at raw numbers, then the raw numbers are skewed if we allow everyone to speak at each hearing who wants to speak, and or how the person perceives the data that was received and massages it to their own understanding.
Yeah, something like that. And you've obviously got groups of people who feel very strongly about issues. You may have a group in opposition to that, but they may not have the organization or whatever to appear at every meeting and to speak at every meeting and so forth.
But so then what you're saying is that you're looking to have the level of input that you want you want clean data inputted to be input into your funnel that you use to make a decision. And what we have given you is just raw data that's not been cleaned. And that was very disconcerting to you.
Yeah, correct.
So
and I know that staff made an effort to look at who was speaking each time and how many times had they spoken. And I made sort of an effort on that myself. And so you can't just look at the number of speakers at each meeting. You have to look at who's speaking, how many times have they spoken, and so forth. I don't want to overcomplicate this. I'm just saying that judging the degree of public commentary and input is a difficult thing. Staff has made an effort to address that in their brief today, which I thought was well done. So, I mean, to actually put in an ordinance or law to come up with the degree to which public response were received, I'm not sure how accurate you can be in determining what that degree is.
Well, Mr. Hall, question to you
Yes.
though, would you
So,
agree that the
Mr. Reeves, Mr.
Yeah,
Reeves,
yeah.
Commissioner Popkin
Sorry.
had a question first, if
Oh,
I
I'm
may.
sorry. I'm
I-
sorry.
I'm listening closely to this conversation, and I think what we're really getting at in this statement is we don't want to be reconsidering very contentious cases that were carefully considered and or denied or approved. We don't want to quickly be revisiting something that brought a lot of public outcry, whether in support or opposition. And so I think the degree of support versus opposition, and I think the nitty gritty details of who and how many is maybe a bit irrelevant to the decision of whether or not to rehear a case, but is maybe more relevant to whether or not that case will be approved once we rehear it. But in the consideration of whether to rehear, opening a can of worms that we know was very contentious and had a lot of public outcry could weigh into our decision to rehear considerably.
I would just wanted to reiterate that our current discussion is to include both the nature and degree. The nature could be, it's something that was already evaluated in that first request that is being brought back. And so I think we're trying to give two-pronged, but this is only one of multiple factors that we are saying may be considered. And so we're just essentially adding this component to consideration. Mr. Reeves?
Yeah, I think, just thumbs up, thumbs down. We can all agree that short-term rentals was a very hostile, lots of pain and suffering and opposition sides. I would not want to rehear that next week. And I don't need to count 15 to 21 and someone blah, blah, blah. I would just say, no, we don't need to hear that again next week.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. All right, I'm going to read this one more time. So this would be Romanet 6. In lieu of the final decision and public responses, we would change that sentence to read, the nature and degree of public support for or opposition to the prior final decision. Okay. Hearing no further discussion.
Madam Chair, one comment.
Yes.
So the one I'm missing, I feel like we dropped the earlier idea of breaking this into two items. One is for the final vote, and the other one is for the degree of public responsiveness.
I kind of disagree with that, Mr. McGregor, and let me tell you why. Because you have the final degree, and when you have the final vote, it begs what was the decision, and not if to pull it apart could open the discussion for every case that someone does not like the final decision. I think they belong together. You have to, when you're coming to the decision, you have to look at both, not unless you want to pull out the process in which the final decision was being made. And I think that would overly complicate the process in which we're trying to get to. We're not trying to complicate it. We're trying to simplify it.
So, but Mr. McGregor, if I may, is your question just essentially maintaining that vote, if you will, that whatever the prior decision that was made, whether it be CPC or council, that information is included?
That's right. Remember, these are only these are for consideration, right? For a commissioner who's looking at an issue. So yeah, I think just for clarity, I would put the vote separate from the other public support or against. And I, if I can add one more thing, I do remember at CPC many times when we're looking at a recommendation from a committee, and it felt like the answer wasn't very clear, didn't understand why they were providing X recommendation instead of Y, I would go back and look at how the vote went to give me an idea whether it was unanimous or not. And it's just one data point in analyzing and getting to making a judgment call.
So would that keep Romanet 6, whether the previous final decision for a change in zoning district classification or boundary of the property was or was not unanimous? So essentially keep that first sentence. I
Yes.
changed if to whether and then added was or was not, because again, that's the question is what was
Right.
that vote?
Right. So do that in addition if the previous final
Right.
vote.
And then keep 7
yeah.
or add a 7, the nature and degree of public support for or opposition to the prior final decision.
Exactly. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. So members, shall I read those again? So the suggestion is to keep what is Romanet 6, whether the previous final decision for a change in the zoning district classification or boundary of the property was or was not unanimous, then add Romanet 7, the nature and degree of public support for or opposition to the prior final decision. Discussion.
Question, Madam Chair. Do I understand from an earlier conversation that the process at CPC, it's not a vote and it only is at a commission? Or why can't we say, instead of whether the previous final decision, why couldn't we be more specific and say whether the previous final vote for a change?
And I'll defer to the city attorney. I think they've used final decision as our consistent language, but could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I think we'd want a level of consistency with the terms, because if we change it to final vote, then the way I would have to read final decision would be something other than a final vote, and I'm struggling to understand what final decision could mean. So just for consistency and clarity, I think they should be the same terms.
Which would be what, decision or vote?
I'm sorry, Mr. McGregor, I didn't hear the question.
So are you saying that the correct word to have there is it better to say decision or to say vote?
I think that decision would be better, but ZOAC could change them all to final vote if that's what was desired, but I think in any event, the terms should be the same.
Well, you vote to get a decision. You don't do a decision to get a vote. So I would say decision. That would be my thinking.
I think we've used decision elsewhere that's
Okay.
for continuity, seem
Well,
more consistent with the overall code.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so we have reworded item 6, changing if to whether and adding was or was not. We had the was not in there. We've added Romanet 7, and then our last item, which was listed as 6, is actually Romanet 8 now. Other factors in which granting a waiver and adding is or is not contrary to the public interest. So keeping that as is, but adding is or is not, so that we have both considerations.
Madam Chair, I'm
Yes.
probably a little dense because of the freezing rain out there. It's affecting my memory. I don't quite understand what we mean in this piece. Factors.
As I understand it, the discussion was allowing for other considerations that we may not have captured here, that there could be other factors.
Okay, now I get it. Thank you.
If I may, I think I could think of at least one, maybe for is not contrary to the public interest, might be, and I think the example was used at the last meeting where you have a piece of property and say an SUP was granted approval on it, and now, there's a huge, it's a big piece of property, and now, there's a really big application that's going to come in for something that's going to be great for the city. I'm not going to put an example in there. You could probably fill that in, but something that would be just fantastic for the city, and you wouldn't want to restrict that. So, and then, you could also do the same, I think, another application comes in for something that would be detrimental or contrary to the public interest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. All right, so we have under, I get back to my first page, 3B, we have 8 Romanettes. And I'm highlighting them on mine. Does anyone want to re-review them? We've gone through them all individually. Okay, hearing none. We have items C and D, which are primarily language cleanup and renumbering. Any discussion on C and D? They're on page 111 of our case report.
Oh, I'm sorry, my screen was stuck, frozen. I couldn't move it. I apologize.
It's also experiencing the winter weather.
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Levy. Any discussion, members?
Wordsmithing or
Yes,
D?
any, all.
Yeah, thank you. Commission, I think probably has to be capitalized.
Everywhere else in the code, the city attorney has just said is lowercase. So they're recommending we keep it lowercase for consistency.
Okay, then that takes care of city council in the line below it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good catch. All right. So members, question. Do we want to see the cleaned up recommendations to come to us? Or do we want to move this to Plan Commission?
I think for myself, I'm very clear with the changes that we're proposing on both the ZOAC request and what staff wants.
Same here.
Yep, same here.
All right. Well, with that, is there a motion or recommendation?
Madam Chair, since you've been reading, since you've got the meticulous notes on this, do you mind making the motion?
If the city attorney has no objection. All right. In the matter of DCA 212-007, I move that we forward the proposed amendments to the 2-year waiver to City Plan Commission following ZOAC request on all items. And in item 3B, Romanettes 1 through 8 for discussion. Clarity,
Second.
would the city attorney like me to read those back?
I think the discussion that ZOAC had was clear, and I think that motion is good, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. So motion by the chair, and I believe I heard Mr. McGregor
Second.
as the second.
Yep.
Either way, or Mr. Reeves, either way. Madam Chair, I do have, I think it's a friendly amendment. I forget how this works, but there was one change that staff recommended in the very first box of theirs where they indicated that it isn't necessary to, in item number 2, I should say, it's D on the 2-year limitation, item number 2 underneath that it's not necessary to be specific about, to include specific use permits in there because it's already dealt with further down in the document. So on that item, I propose using staff's recommendation to delete the second
I'm
portion.
gonna, yeah, I'm going to ask Ms. Levy to clarify. It was my understanding that we needed to keep that 2-year waiver if we kept approvals. Is that correct?
Let's go back a minute. Okay, so you're keeping in granting approvals.
Right, that's item number 1.
Correct.
Right, and so since you are keeping the approvals, you have to come down to number 2 and keep this one that says the commission or council renders a final decision of denial without prejudice, or if the city council grants a specific use permit and imposes a time limit of 2 years or less, then the 2-year limitation is waived. So actually, it's only removing or exempting the SUPs if the time limit is 2 years or less.
And it's connected.
Is that clear, Mr. McGregor?
No,
makes
it isn't.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I know there's a little bit of back and forth. So if we are including the limitation or the exception for cases where the request was granted, right? That's in item number 1. Then you're saying we also need to include the specific use permit in item number 2.
Chair, may I contribute? This is Sarah May.
Yes, Ms. May.
Thank you. Yes, so the purpose of exempting SUPs with approvals for 2 years or less is because when if a property is going to renew their SUP, they must submit to staff, to come through CPC and council within 120 to 180 days before it expires. So at a year and if it's a 2-year approval, then they have to come in within 3 to 6 months of that expiration, which is within 2 years. So this is just saying, hey, not every single SUP that has been approved for 2 years or less has to get a waiver. Because if we take it out, every single one of them are going to have to get a waiver.
Okay, then I withdraw my friendly amendment to the motion.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. McGregor. No, that was one I struggled with as well. So I appreciate you clarifying for us. All right, so we have a motion. We have a second by Mr. Reeves. Any further discussion?
No.
Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries unanimously. Our other agenda item today is approval of the minutes. Revised minutes were circulated electronically this morning to correct our attendance record. Is there a motion to approve the revised minutes?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair Blair, for your motion. Thank you, Mr. McGregor, for your second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Minutes are adopted. We have no other matters before us today, so is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Vice Chair Blair. It is 10:51 a.m. and we are adjourned.
Please
Thank
stay
you for the
warm, you
excellent
guys.
discussion. Staff for joining us on a cold winter day. Commissioner Young, Mr. King for making